Every single soul in Dusty Creek, Texas knew that David Holloway was courting Mae Collins all wrong, and not a single one of them had the nerve to tell him so, except for his youngest son, who was only 9 years old and apparently the wisest person in the entire county. The year was 1878, and Dusty Creek sat in the Texas Hill Country like a sun-bleached gem along the banks of the Pedernales River. Population 412 souls, give or take whoever had ridden in from the ranches that week. It was the kind of town where the post office doubled as the general store, where the barber knew your father's name before you even opened your mouth, and where a person's business was everyone's business whether they wanted it that way or not. The red dust settled on every porch railing and windowsill, and the sky above went on forever, that particular shade of Texas blue that made a person feel both tremendously small and completely free. Mae Collins had come to Dusty Creek 3 years prior, in the autumn of 1875, when she was 26 years old and freshly widowed after her husband Thomas Collins had taken a fever on the trail coming west from Georgia. She had buried him outside of San Antonio with the help of 2 kind strangers and a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through, and then she had climbed back onto the wagon bench, clicked her tongue at the horse, and kept going, because that was simply the kind of woman Mae Collins was. She had settled in Dusty Creek because the wheel of the wagon had cracked on the outskirts of town, and the wheelwright there, old Mr. Abernathy, had told her it would take 4 days to fix. In those 4 days, Mae had walked every street, admired the schoolhouse that needed a proper teacher, spoken to the reverend about the congregation, and quietly fallen in love with the rolling hills and the way the cedar trees smelled in the early morning. When Mr. Abernathy had the wheel fixed and her wagon ready, she had thanked him, paid him, and then asked if anyone in town had a room to let. She had been in Dusty Creek ever since. Mae ran the schoolhouse with a firm and gentle hand, teaching children aged 5 to 14 their letters and their arithmetic and a healthy appreciation for reading. She lived in a small house just off the main road, a house she rented from Mrs. Eliza Thorne, who was the widow of the town's former mayor and who charged a fair price and kept the roof in good repair. Mae's garden was the envy of the neighborhood, full of climbing roses and kitchen herbs, and a patch of sunflowers she grew purely, because she loved the way they turned their faces toward the light. She was, by any honest accounting, a beautiful woman. Not in the showpiece way that made men stutter and forget their manners, but in the real and lasting way. The kind of beauty that came from clear eyes and a genuine smile, and the way her dark hair always had one strand escaping no matter how carefully she pinned it. She had a laugh that carried on the warm Texas air, and she had opinions she was not afraid to voice, and she had a kindness that was practical rather than soft, the kind that gave you what you needed rather than just what you wanted to hear. The whole town had been waiting for someone to court Mae Collins, because it seemed like a terrible waste for a woman like that to be alone. And when David Holloway finally turned his attention her way in the spring of 1878, every single person in Dusty Creek leaned forward with interest. David Holloway was 34 years old, a cattle rancher who owned the rocking H spread about 4 miles east of town. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and sun-browned, with dark eyes and dark hair going slightly silver at the temples, and he had the kind of steady, quiet competence that made people trust him with their problems. He had been widowed himself, 5 years back, when his wife Clara had died in childbirth along with the infant that would have been their daughter. He had raised his 2 sons alone since then: Eli, who was 14 and already nearly his father's height, and Sam, who was 9 and still small enough to fit in the crook of his father's arm when a thunderstorm woke him in the night. David Holloway was a good man. Everyone in Dusty Creek would tell you that without hesitation. He was honest, he worked hard, he paid his debts, he helped his neighbors during branding season, and he had never once been found drunk and disorderly, which in 1878 Texas put him ahead of a considerable portion of the population. He was also, it turned out, absolutely terrible at courting a woman. It began in April, when the bluebonnets were thick along every road and the air carried the promise of good weather to come. David had ridden into town on a Tuesday afternoon to pick up supplies, and had encountered Mae Collins coming out of the general store with a sack of flour balanced on her hip, and a list she was reading as she walked. He had not been looking where he was going, and neither had she, and the collision had sent her flour sack tumbling and scattered her list across the boardwalk. He had gathered the list papers with considerable fumbling and helped her rebalance the flour, and when she had looked up at him with those clear gray eyes and said, "Well, I suppose that's one way to meet a person," he had felt something shift in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. He had thought about Mae Collins for 2 solid weeks before he worked up the nerve to do anything about it. His first move was to send her a gift. He had ridden into town with a fine smoked ham from his smokehouse, which was genuinely excellent. Everyone who had tasted David Holloway's smoked ham agreed it was the best in 3 counties. He had given it to Reverend Pickard to deliver on his behalf, because he felt that was more proper than leaving it on her porch himself. Mae had received the ham with genuine puzzlement. It was a fine gift, practical and generous, and she had written a polite thank-you note in return. But ham was not exactly a romantic gesture. Ham was what you brought when someone's barn burned down or when a family was grieving. Half the town had laughed when they heard about it. Widow Thorne had pressed her lips together to hide her smile. The barber, a man named Chester Pratt who knew everything and shared most of it, had told at least 11 people before supper. David did not know any of this. He was encouraged by the thank-you note and decided to continue his campaign. His second move was to attend one of Mae's school performances. She had organized a small theatrical presentation of scenes from American history, which the children performed for their parents on a Saturday afternoon. David had dressed in his good suit, which he had not worn since his sister's wedding 2 years prior, and had sat in the front row with his hat on his knee. He had clapped enthusiastically at all the right moments. He had found the whole thing genuinely charming, because the children were earnest, and Mae moved among them with such easy affection. But when the performance was finished and parents were mingling and congratulating the teacher, David had spent the entire conversation talking about how well-behaved his son Sam was compared to some of the other students. He had not said anything unkind about anyone, but he had also not said a single word to Mae that was personal or warm, or that indicated he saw her as anything other than Sam's schoolteacher. He had shaken her hand formally at the end, thanked her for the fine education she was providing his boy, and left. Mae had watched him ride away and thought that David Holloway was a thoroughly decent man who seemed to think of her in entirely professional terms. The whole town, meanwhile, could see exactly what David was trying to do, and they were cringing on his behalf with the helpless energy of people watching a man walk toward a hole in the road that he cannot see. His third move had come in May, and this was the one that really cemented the town's collective concern. He had heard from Chester the barber that Mae had admired a horse being ridden through town by a man passing through, a beautiful gray roan with exceptional conformation. David, being a man who understood horses deeply, had taken this information and run with it in the wrong direction entirely. He had written her a letter, a very formal, very carefully composed letter offering to bring her a horse from his ranch to borrow any time she needed to ride out of town, as he understood she did not own one herself and relied on hired rigs from the livery. It was a generous offer. It was also the kind of offer you made to a neighbor, or to a business associate, or to a friend of your late wife's who needed practical assistance. It was not an offer that said, "I think about you when you are not in the room, and I would very much like to know what makes you laugh." Mae had accepted the offer graciously because it was graciously made, and she was not a foolish woman who refused practical help out of pride. She had used the horse twice. Each time, David had had the horse ready at the edge of town, and had handed over the reins with the formal courtesy of a man conducting a transaction, and Mae had ridden away wondering what on earth she was supposed to make of David Holloway. June arrived. The heat came down on Dusty Creek like a warm hand, pressing the whole town lower toward the ground. People moved slower, sat on their porches longer, and spent considerably more time discussing David Holloway's peculiar courtship of Mae Collins. "He brought her a whole bolt of calico last week," reported Mrs. Eugenia Marsh, who ran the boarding house and missed nothing. "Just left it at the school with a card that said for your classroom from D. Holloway, like she was a charitable institution. The man doesn't know how to talk to a woman," said Chester the barber with the authority of someone who had listened to a great many men talk about their problems. "He knows how to provide for a woman, which is something different entirely." "Someone ought to tell him," said Mrs. Eliza Thorne, who was Mae's landlady and harbored a particular affection for her tenant. "It's almost painful to watch." "Someone ought to tell her too," said Reverend Pickard, who had been observing from the position of disinterested spiritual authority. "I believe she's entirely convinced he's just a neighborly sort of fellow." This was, unfortunately, correct. By June, Mae Collins had decided that David Holloway was simply one of those extraordinarily thoughtful, community-minded men who made it his business to look out for everyone around him. She had decided this because every single thing he had done could be interpreted that way, and because nothing he had done had indicated any particular personal interest in her as a woman. She had filed him neatly in the category of good neighbor in her mind, and turned her attention back to her garden and her students. Which was a pity, because Mae Collins had, somewhere in the blur of April and May, found herself thinking about David Holloway more than was strictly necessary for someone who was simply her neighbor. She had noticed the way he listened when she spoke, actually listened, not the polite half-attention that was the usual male offering. She had noticed the way he was with his sons, the easy warmth of it, the way young Sam could tuck himself under his father's arm without ceremony. She had noticed his hands, which were a working man's hands but were always careful and precise. But she was a practical woman and a private one, and she was not about to make a fool of herself over a man who clearly saw her as a neighbor and nothing more. She had been on her own for 3 years. She knew how to be on her own. It was Sam Holloway who first said anything out loud. It happened on a Thursday morning in late June, when Sam had stayed after school to help me clean the chalk erasers by banging them against the fence post outside, a task he had volunteered for with suspicious enthusiasm. Mae had been sweeping the schoolroom floor, and Sam had come back inside with chalk dust on his trousers and settled himself on the edge of his desk with the comfortable ease of a child who trusted the adult in the room. "Miss Collins," Sam said, "do you like my father?" Mae had kept sweeping because she was experienced with 9-year-olds and knew the answer to this question required careful handling. "I think your father is a very fine man, Sam. Why do you ask?" Sam had thought about this with great seriousness, his small face scrunched. "Because he likes you, a lot. He talks about you sometimes at supper, not talking but thinking, you know. When someone is thinking about something but it comes out in what they say about other things." Mae had stopped sweeping then. She had looked at Sam Holloway with new attention. "Does he now?" "Yes, ma'am." Sam had swung his legs. "He asked Eli and me the other day if we thought the schoolhouse needed new window glass because he thought one of the panes looked thin. And Eli said that the schoolhouse wasn't any of our business, and Pa got this look on his face like he'd said something embarrassing without meaning to. I figured that out myself," Sam added with some pride. Mae had been quiet for a moment. "Your father has been very kind to me this spring." "He's been trying," Sam said carefully. "But I think he's been doing it wrong. He's real good at taking care of things, but he doesn't always know how to just be with a person. Ma used to say so too. She said Pa showed love by fixing things and bringing things, but she had to teach him to just sit with her sometimes." Sam paused. "Eli says I shouldn't talk about Ma so much, but I think it's okay to talk about her." "I think so too," Mae said softly. Sam had nodded, satisfied. "What do you actually want, Miss Collins?" If a man was courting you properly, what would you want him to do? And Mae Collins, who was 29 years old and a schoolteacher and a widow and generally a very composed woman, had sat down in her chair and thought about that question with complete honesty. Because it was asked with complete honesty, the way only children ask things. "I want someone who just sits with me," she said finally. "Who comes to my garden on a Sunday afternoon and doesn't bring anything and doesn't fix anything. Who just talks to me. Who asks me what I think about things and actually wants to know the answer. Who doesn't treat me like a problem to be solved or a debt to be repaid. Just someone who wants to be where I am because being where I am is where they want to be." Sam had listened to every word of this with solemn attention. Then he had hopped down from his desk, dusted his trousers with both hands and said, "Okay. Thank you, Miss Collins. I'll see you tomorrow." He had been out the door before Mae had quite processed what had just happened. That evening at the Rocking H, while Eli was doing his reading and the lanterns were burning warm and low in the ranch house kitchen, Sam Holloway came and found his father mending a piece of harness at the kitchen table, which was where David Holloway spent most evenings doing something useful with his hands. "Pa," Sam said, climbing onto the chair across from him, "I need to talk to you about Miss Collins." David's hand stilled. He looked up at his youngest son with the careful expression of a man who didn't know what was coming and was bracing himself. "All right. You've been doing it wrong," Sam said. "All of it, the ham and the horse and the cloth and all of it. You've been taking care of her like she's a problem, but she's not a problem, she's a person." David was quiet for a long moment. He set down the harness piece very slowly. "Is that so?" "That's so." Sam leaned his elbows on the table, completely unintimidated by his father's size or his silence. "She told me what she actually wants. She wants someone to just sit with her, not bring things, not fix things. Just come to her and be with her and talk to her and want to hear what she thinks. She said that's it, that's all." David Holloway looked at his 9-year-old son for a long time. The lantern light moved on the walls. Outside, one of the horses in the corral stamped and blew. Eli looked up from his reading in the other room, quietly interested. "She told you that," David said. "I asked her," Sam said simply, "because I wanted to know." David was quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. His jaw worked slightly. He rubbed the back of his neck with one broad hand. "I didn't know I thought I was being helpful." "You were," Sam said. "But helpful isn't the same as courting." Eli said so too. Eli, from the other room, said nothing but turned his page with somewhat pointed emphasis. David looked down at the harness piece in his hands. Then he set it on the table and folded his hands over it and stared at the grain of the wood. A man thinking hard about something, the way Mae had described without knowing she was describing him exactly. "She wants me to just sit with her," he said, half to himself. "Sunday afternoon," Sam said helpfully. "Her garden." "Samuel," David said, "how did you get to be 9 years old in this wise?" "I just listen," Sam said, with the sublime confidence of a child who has done something well and knows it. "You should try it, Pa." David had laughed, a low, real sound, and reached across the table to ruffle his son's hair. "Go finish your supper." "I already finished it." "Then go bother your brother." Sam went, satisfied with the work of the evening. David sat at the table for a long time after, alone with the harness and the lantern light, and the particular feeling of a man who has been looking at something from entirely the wrong angle and has just been turned around to face the right one. He was embarrassed, as much as he was willing to admit it to himself. He thought about the ham and the cloth and the horse loan and the school performance, and he could see, now that someone had drawn the outline for him, exactly what Mae must have made of all of it. He thought about her garden, which he had passed on the road any number of times and which he had always noticed, the climbing roses on the porch rail, the sunflowers standing bright and tall along the south fence. He had never stopped. He had been so careful to be useful, to be unimposing, to give her things that had clear practical value. He had been so afraid of overstepping, of being too much, of making a fool of himself, that he had given her nothing at all of himself. He had given her a ham when he should have given her a conversation. He had given her a borrowed horse when he should have given her an afternoon. He had treated courting a woman like a business proposition when it was not that at all, and never had been. He thought about Clara, who had loved him patiently through the early years of their marriage when he had still been learning that love was not a problem to be managed, but a thing to be lived in. Clara would have found the situation equal parts funny and tender, and she would have told him to go talk to the woman. Clara had always been direct that way. He got up, put the harness aside, banked the fire, and went to bed with his mind full of gray eyes and climbing roses and the specific warm feeling of a thing that had not yet been fixed but was clearly, finally, fixable. Sunday arrived the way Texas Sundays arrived in high summer, slow and heavy with heat and the drowsy sound of insects, the whole world seeming to slow to a more honest pace than the rest of the week. Church was done by 11 o'clock. The Reverend had given a thoughtful sermon on patience. David had sat in his pew thinking about patience and gardens, and had not heard a single word past the opening scripture. After church, he told Eli to keep an eye on Sam and that he would be home by supper time. Eli had looked at him with 14-year-old frankness and said, "Are you going to see Miss Collins?" "I might be," David said. Eli had nodded once with the dignity of a boy trying to be a man. "Good," he said, and that had been that. David rode into town slowly, in no particular hurry but not stopping either, the way a man moves when he has made up his mind about something and is simply getting there. He left his horse at the post by the livery rather than outside Mae's house, because it seemed presumptuous to announce himself that way. He walked the half-block to her house on foot, hat in hand. She was in the garden when he came through the gate, which stood open, because the gate always stood open in the afternoons. He had noticed that without registering it until now. She was on her knees beside the rose bed, pulling something from the base of the plants, and she had a smear of earth on her forearm and a loose braid falling over one shoulder, and she looked up when his shadow fell across her and went very still. "Mr. Holloway," she said. He had practiced what he was going to say during the ride in. He had prepared something reasonable and measured, and not too much. Then he saw her looking up at him from the garden dirt with those clear gray eyes, and his preparation dissolved entirely, and what came out was simply the truth. "I've been making a mess of this," he said. "All spring. I kept thinking the right way to show you I cared was to give you things, useful things, but I understand now that what I was actually doing was making it so you had no idea I cared at all. And I'm sorry for that. I should have just come and talked to you." Mae sat back on her heels and looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her working through several emotions in quick succession, none of which he could quite read. "How did you come to understand that?" she said, David's mouth curved. "Sam told me." Mae's composure cracked open into a sudden bright laugh, the kind that carried on the summer air just the way Chester the barber had described to at least 11 people. It was the best sound David Holloway had heard in years. "He asked me," Mae said, and she was still smiling, shaking her head at the wonder of it. "He just asked me straight out what I wanted. I didn't realize he was going to carry the answer home." "He's a good boy," David said. "He's the wisest person in this county," Mae said, which was so close to what David himself had thought that he felt something warm settle in his chest. "Will you sit down, Mr. Holloway?" There was a wooden bench along the porch railing, half in shadow, surrounded by the climbing roses. He sat. She dusted off her hands and came to sit beside him, not too close, but close enough that he could smell the clean scent of fresh earth and roses. The garden hummed around them. A mockingbird was working through its repertoire in the cedar tree by the fence. For a moment they were both quiet, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. "You can call me David," he said, "if you're willing. After all the trouble I've put you through this spring, I think we've moved past formal address." "You haven't put me through any trouble," Mae said, with a gentleness that was honest rather than polite. "You were kind to me, I just couldn't figure out what you meant by it." "What did you think I meant?" She tilted her head, looking at the garden rather than at him. "I thought you were just a thorough neighbor, the kind of man who looks after everyone around him the same way." "I do look after people," David admitted, But not everyone got a smoked ham. She laughed again, softer this time. I did wonder about the ham. I didn't know what else to do, he said. I hadn't. It's been a while since I tried to do something like this. And I wasn't sure you'd want me to try. You seem very complete on your own. Me turned to look at him at that, and the expression on her face was something he couldn't quite put a word to but wanted to see again. A person can be complete on their own and still want company, she said. Yes, he said. I know that. I should have understood it applied to you too. What made you come today, she asked. Besides Sam. Sam was the start of it, David said. But all week I've been thinking about what he told me. He said you wanted someone to just sit with you. To just be with you and talk. And I thought, I can do that. I want to do that. I've wanted to be here all spring, and I've been finding every way to be useful instead of just being present. Me was quiet for a moment. A soft breeze moved through the garden and the roses stirred, and the mockingbird said something complicated in the cedar tree. Well, she said, you're here now. I am, he said. They talked for 3 hours. It was the kind of conversation that happened when two people were both secretly relieved to finally be talking, not around things, not about practical matters, but about real ones. She asked him about the ranch, and he told her about it without the usual deflection. Told her about what he loved about it and what was hard. About the particular satisfaction of watching a new calf figure out how to walk, and the particular frustration of a fence line that seemed to need repair in the same place every single spring. She told him about the school, about the children who were quick, and the ones who needed more time, and how both groups were equally rewarding in different ways. She told him about Georgia, where she had grown up, and about the long journey west, and about how she had meant to keep going to California and had stopped here instead and had never for a moment been sorry. He told her about Clara. It came up naturally, the way these things do when two people are being honest with each other, and he talked about her with the love and the loss all mixed together, the way it actually was, and me listened without flinching, the way a woman listened who understood about grief and had her own. She told him about Thomas. She told him about the good years of their marriage and about the terrible trail west and the fever and the strangers who had helped her bury him. She told him she had cried in the wagon for a solid day after, and then had set her face west and kept going, because she had not known what else to do. He listened to every word of it. By the time the afternoon light had stretched long and gold across the garden, and the air had cooled to something bearable, David Holloway felt more at ease than he had felt in years, and Mae Collins was looking at him with an expression that was considerably warmer than anything she had shown him in all the months of ham and horse borrowing. I should get back to the boys, he said with genuine reluctance, but I'd like to come back if you'll have me, not with anything, just like this. I'd like that, she said simply. He stood, settling his hat back on his head, and looked at her one more moment in the garden in the late light with the roses and the mockingbird and the smell of warm earth and summer all around her. She looked up at him with those gray eyes. Thank you for coming, she said. And will you thank Sam for me? I will, he said, although he'll be insufferable about it. She laughed, and he carried that sound all the way back to his horse. Word moved through Dusty Creek the way words always did, which was fast and thorough. Chester the barber had seen David Holloway walk to Mae Collins's house with his hat in his hand and no package under his arm, and had correctly interpreted the significance of the hat and the absence of the package. By supper, a good portion of the town knew that David had gone to sit in her garden. By breakfast Monday, it was common knowledge, and several people were treating it as a personal victory. Mrs. Eliza Thorne, who had watched from behind her parlor curtain with absolutely no shame whatsoever, told her sister that the two of them had sat on that bench and talked for 3 hours, and both of them had been smiling by the end of it, and she pronounced this development long overdue. There's still a long way to go, Reverend Pickard said cautiously at the Monday morning gathering outside the post office. Oh, that man's halfway home, said Chester with the confidence of a man who had been watching human nature across a barber chair for 20 years. The hard part was getting him there. At the Rocking H that evening, Sam sat across the supper table from his father and waited with barely contained patience while the biscuits were passed and the beans were dished. Finally, when his father had settled and the table was quiet, Sam said, "Did it work?" David looked at his youngest son over the rim of his coffee cup. "Did what work?" "Pa," Sam said, with the exasperated patience of someone who knew they were being teased and did not entirely appreciate it. "Yes," David said. "It worked. And Miss Collins says to thank you." Sam sat up straight with a satisfaction that was entirely too large for his 9-year-old frame. Eli, who had pretended for weeks to have no interest in the situation, looked up from his plate with a carefully neutral expression that didn't hide the warmth underneath. "Will you see her again?" Eli asked. "I intend to," David said. "Good," said both boys, in almost perfect unison, and David looked at them both, Eli with his mother's eyes and Sam with his mother's, way of saying the exact thing that needed saying, and felt the particular fullness that came of knowing that the people you loved were well and growing and rooting for you even as you tried to do better. He went back to Mae's garden the following Sunday, and the one after that. And on the third Sunday, he brought Sam along, because Sam had been asking, and because Mae had said she would enjoy meeting his youngest properly under circumstances where she was not his teacher, and because David found that his son's company was a good thing to offer alongside his own. Sam had sat in the garden with them and talked with complete comfort about everything from the ranch dog's new litter of puppies to a particularly interesting rock he had found in the creek bed, and Mae had listened to every word with the genuine attention she gave all children, and Sam had gone home that evening glowing with the particular warmth of a child who has been truly heard by an adult who matters to them. After that, the three of them occasionally spent Sunday afternoons together, and occasionally David came alone, and occasionally Mae came to the ranch to see the puppies and the horses and the wide open land that David had spent 15 years shaping into something. Eli was more careful than Sam, slower to warm, carrying more of his mother in the way he moved through the world cautiously, observantly, holding his trust until it had been earned. Mae did not push. She was patient with Eli in the same way she was patient with her slower students, not making the lack of ease into a problem, simply being consistently present and kind until the ease arrived on its own. It arrived one evening in August, when Mae had stayed for supper at the ranch house and Eli had shown her, because she had asked about it, the book of maps he kept in his room, hand-drawn maps of the surrounding territory, remarkably detailed for a 14-year-old, every trail and creek and landmark carefully marked. She had looked at those maps with genuine interest, and had asked him real questions about how he had drawn them and what tools he used, and whether he intended to keep mapping as he got older. Eli had answered one question, then two, then three, and by the end he was talking about his maps the way he talked to no one except his father, with the fully open enthusiasm of someone who loved something completely. Mae had listened to it all. When she was gone, Eli had sat down at the kitchen table across from his father and said, in the measured way he had, "She's good." David had looked at his older son. "She is." Eli had nodded once and gone back to his room, and David had understood that the question of Mae Collins was, for Eli, settled. September brought a shift in the air and a sweetness to the evenings that didn't exist in the brutal heat of summer. David and Mae had fallen into a rhythm by then that the town watched with collective warmth Sunday afternoons, the occasional weekday evening when he was in town, and stopped to walk her home from the schoolhouse. The way they sat together at church now, without anyone having to engineer it, their shoulders easy and close. The whole town had moved from anxious observers to satisfied ones, Chester the barber holding court on the subject with a proprietorial pride, as though he personally had arranged the whole thing. What the town did not see, because it happened in Mae's garden in the late evening with only the stars for witness, was the exact moment in the second week of September when David Holloway took Mae Collins's hand in his for the first time. They had been sitting on the bench as they often sat, the roses going to their autumn version of themselves, The smell of the evening air, that particular cedar and dry grass combination that was purely Texas. Mae had been telling him something. He could not afterward have said what, and her hand had been on the bench between them, and it had seemed like the most natural thing in the world to cover it with his own. She had stopped talking. He had not moved his hand. "Me," he said, and he had not called her that before, always Miss Collins in public and the more careful ma'am in private, and the sound of her name in his voice was something new between them. "David," she said back, just as quiet. "I mean to say this properly, and I want you to know I mean it," he said. "I care about you. I think I've cared about you since April, even if I was showing it in entirely the wrong ways. I would like very much, if you're willing, to do this properly, to court you properly, to see if there is something here worth building." Me looked at him in the dark garden, and the stars were brilliant overhead the way they got in September when the summer haze had thinned, and the silence between them was warm and full. "I think there's something worth building," she said. "I've thought so for a while." "Why didn't you say so?" he asked, with no accusation in it, just honest curiosity. "Because you were giving me flour and horses and not yourself," she said, a gentle smile on her face. "I wasn't going to reach for something that wasn't being offered. It was always being offered," he said. "I just didn't know how to make it clear." "I know that now," she said. His hand tightened on hers just slightly. She turned her hand and laced her fingers through his, and they sat in the garden in the September dark with the stars spilling across the sky and the roses and the mockingbird, which apparently never slept, and the whole warm, ordinary miracle of two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment to be ready. October was golden and cool, and Dusty Creek moved through harvest season with the particular energy of a community coming together for the work that needed doing. David and me were openly acknowledged as a pair by then, in the way of small towns where public acknowledgement happened not with announcement, but with the simple fact of two people being seen together so consistently that the community absorbed them as a unit. David had taken to riding into town on Tuesday evenings after the schoolhouse was closed, and walking me to the little restaurant run by a German family named Schuster, where the food was good, and the portions were generous, and the proprietors were discreet enough not to hover. They talked over supper with the ease of people who had discovered they could talk about almost anything, which was the particular joy of two people who had each been a little alone in their own heads for a long time. He learned that Me had strong opinions about books, which she got in the mail from a bookseller in San Antonio, and read in the evenings with a cup of tea. He learned that she was a good enough cook to be embarrassed by bad food, that she could do basic carpentry because her father had taught her, that she was frightened of deep water though she had never told anyone that before, and that she missed the sound of rain on a tin roof, which was a Georgia sound and not so common in the hill country. She learned that David had a quiet but real sense of humor that only appeared once he trusted you, dry and unexpected and worth waiting for. She learned that he had taught himself to read properly from his wife's books, having had very little formal schooling as a boy, and that he was now a careful and appreciative reader who was slightly embarrassed about enjoying poetry. She learned that he sang to the horses when he worked alone in the barn, old hymns and folk songs, and that Sam had told her this with the clear intention of charming her on his father's behalf. She learned that David felt things deeply and said them slowly, and meant every word he did say. By November, when the first real cold came down from the north, and the fires were burning in every hearth in Dusty Creek, Mae Collins had come to the quiet internal conclusion that she was in love with David Holloway. She held this conclusion for about a week, examining it from various angles the way a careful woman examined a thing she was about to commit to, and finding it solid from every side. David arrived at his own conclusion somewhat differently, in the way men sometimes did, not through examination, but through the blunt recognition that arrived one evening when he was riding home from town, and realized that the whole of the 4 miles had passed without him noticing, because he had been thinking about the way Mae had laughed at something he had said over supper, turning her face away for a moment with her hand over her mouth, and then looking back at him with delight in those gray eyes. He had thought about that laugh the whole 4 miles home, and had arrived at the ranch gate with the clear and simple understanding that this woman was as necessary to him as weather and work and the sound of his boys' voices, and that whatever came next, he did not want to be without her. It snowed in Dusty Creek in December, which was unusual enough to be an event. It was not a heavy snow, nothing like the stories coming from up north, but a gentle, thorough covering that turned the brown hill country soft and white and strange. The children were ecstatic. Mae dismissed school an hour early because she could see that no learning was happening, and the children poured into the street and into the soft snowfall with the pure animal joy of youth encountering something wonderful. David came into town that afternoon with a wagon load of firewood for several of the older residents, which was exactly the kind of useful, unassuming thing he did for the community, and he passed the schoolhouse just as Mae was watching her students disappear into the snow. He stopped the wagon. "Miss Collins," he said, and she corrected him without looking up. "Mae," she said. "Mae." The sound of her name in his voice had not become ordinary yet. "Do you want to come see the ranch in the snow? The boys would like it." She had looked up at him on the wagon bench with the snow coming down soft and steady, and her cheeks had gone pink with cold and something else. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." She had ridden out to the rocking H in the wagon beside him, and Eli and Sam had materialized from somewhere on the property, with the instinctive awareness children had of important arrivals, and Sam had immediately begun trying to build something with the insufficient snow, while Eli stood on the porch and pretended he hadn't been watching for the wagon. David had made coffee inside, and they had all sat around the fire in the ranch house living room, which was a big warm room with good furniture and a stone fireplace, and the accumulated evidence of 2 boys growing up boots by the door, books stacked on the table, a drawing Sam had done pinned to the wall. Mae had looked around that room and had felt at home in it, which was both a simple feeling and a significant one. Later, when the boys were in bed and the snow had stopped, and the moonlight was making the white land outside luminous and strange, David and Mae had stood on the porch together with their coffee cups and looked at the hills going silver and still in every direction. "Mae," he said. She waited. "I want to ask you to marry me." The words landed quietly between them in the cold air, and she turned to look at him. He was looking at the hills rather than at her, which she understood. David Holloway said true things better when he didn't have to manage another person's response while he was saying them. She had learned this about him. "I want to do it right," he said, still looking at the hills. "I want to be sure you're sure. I don't want to rush this. If you need more time, I'll wait. I just want you to know that I'm certain, and I have been for a while, and I wanted you to know where I stood." She set her coffee cup on the porch railing and turned to face him fully. "David Holloway," she said. He turned then, looking at her. "Ask me properly," she said. Something shifted in his face. He set down his own cup. He turned toward her entirely, and there in the cold moonlit air with the snow all around and the horses quiet in the barn and the boys asleep inside, he said, with the particular voice he had when something mattered most, "Mae Collins, I love you. I would very much like you to be my wife and a mother to my boys and everything that comes with all of it for the rest of whatever time we have. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without a single moment's hesitation. "I will." He reached out and took her face in both his hands, careful and warm, and she put her hands over his, and he kissed her for the first time there on the porch in the snowlight, which was a very fine place to be kissed for the first time. And the moonlight lay across the white hills like something from a hymn, and it was, in every way that counted, exactly right. Sam took the news the next morning as though it was the logical conclusion of an argument he had been making for months, which in his view it was. "I told him what to do," he explained to Eli, with the satisfied calm of a general reviewing a won campaign, "and it worked." Eli put his elbow on Sam's head in the brotherly way of a taller boy asserting gentle dominance. "You did good," Eli said, with full sincerity. Sam grinned wide enough to show the gap where he'd lost a tooth the week before. Mee came to the ranch for supper that evening, and afterward they told the boys together. Sam's response has been noted above. Eli's response was to stand up from the table and cross to me and extend his hand with a formality that had something of his father in it, and say, "I'm glad, Miss Collins. I'm really glad." And me had taken his hand and then pulled him into a hug, which he bore with 14-year-old stiffness for exactly 2 seconds before his arms came around her, and he hugged her back. The wedding was set for spring. Me spent the winter months in a state of contented anticipation, and David spent them with the specific productive energy of a man who had something good to look forward to and wanted everything in order when it arrived. He expanded the ranch house, added a proper parlor, repaired and repainted the kitchen, built me a study with good windows so she had a room of her own for her books and her marking. He did not tell her about this. He let Sam tell her, because Sam could not keep a secret to save his life and was visibly suffering under the attempt. Me laughed when Sam finally cracked, one evening in February, and told her about the study. She drove out to the ranch the next day while David was away mending the fence line, and Eli led her into the house and showed her the room. It had good pine shelves along one wall, and 3 wide windows looking east over the hill, and a writing desk positioned to catch the morning light. She stood in the middle of it, and felt something complete and right settle all the way through her. When David came in at sundown, mud on his boots and honest sweat on his collar, she was still at the ranch, sitting on the porch. He stopped when he saw her. "Sam told you," he said. "He tried so hard not to," she said. "It wasn't his fault." David came up the porch steps and stood before her, and she reached out and took his hand. She did this easily now, naturally, and held it. "It's the most beautiful room," she said. "Thank you." He sat down beside her, still holding her hand. "It's your room," he said. "It's where you should be. Your books and your work, your own place in the house." He paused. "I know I used to be bad at just sitting with a person, but I've been practicing, and I'm also working on understanding that a person needs their own space inside a shared life. Clara taught me the first part. You're teaching me the second." Me looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "You are a very different man than you think you are," she said. "What do you mean?" "You think you're someone who does things wrong and has to be corrected," she said. "But what I see is someone who listens and changes and tries. That's not doing it wrong. That's how love actually works." He was quiet. Then he brought her hand up and held it against his chest, just for a moment, the way he had of saying things without words when the words were too much. She felt his heartbeat under her palm. "I'm going to spend a long time working on being worthy of you," he said. "You already are," she said. "Just keep being here." The wedding took place on a Saturday in April, 1879, on a morning that was everything a Texas spring morning ought to be, the air warm and clear, the hills green from winter rain, the cedar trees releasing that particular sharp sweetness, wildflowers running thick along every road. Me wore her best dress, a deep blue wool she had purchased in San Antonio on a visit the previous month, altered and pressed until it was as fine a wedding dress as the hill country had seen. She pinned a spray of climbing roses from her own garden into her dark hair, and she walked from the church to the reception with her arm in David's, and the whole of Dusty Creek lined up along the road to watch, because the whole of Dusty Creek had invested considerably in this outcome and intended to enjoy it. Reverend Pickard performed the ceremony with dignified joy, and when it was done and David kissed his bride, Chester the barber, who was standing near the back with his arms crossed and an expression of deep satisfaction, said quietly to the woman next to him, "I knew it. I said so from the beginning." This was not entirely accurate, but no one in earshot was inclined to correct him. Sam Holloway, standing at his father's side in a suit that was already slightly too small because he was growing at a rate that alarmed the tailor, was smiling the smile of someone who had done something good and knew it. He caught Me's eye when she and David turned from the Reverend, and she winked at him, one small private acknowledgement of the role he had played, and Sam stood up straighter than he had ever stood in his life. Eli, on his father's other side, watched me come through the ceremony with the serious attention of a young man working out what he felt about something important. When it was done and the four of them were standing together in the spring light, father, son, and now wife and stepmother, Eli said, with the careful honesty he had always had, "Welcome to the family, Me." He said it like he meant it. He did mean it. Me pressed his arm with her hand. "Thank you, Eli. I'm very happy to be here." The reception was held in the field beside the church, as was Dusty Creek's custom for celebrations that couldn't fit indoors, which was all of them. There were tables draped in cotton cloth and piled with food, every woman in the county having contributed something, and there was a three-piece band playing in the far corner, a fiddle and a guitar and a man with a concertina who played everything faster than strictly necessary but with tremendous spirit. There was dancing on the flattened grass, and children running between the tables, and the general warm noise of a community celebrating. David danced with me. This is worth noting, because David Holloway was not a man who danced. He had not danced at anything in years, possibly a decade, but he had asked Eli, quietly in the weeks before the wedding, to teach him a basic waltz. Eli, who had learned from his mother, had stood in the kitchen of the ranch house and walked his father through the steps with the straight-faced patience of a boy trying very hard not to find something funny. The result was not elegant, but it was recognizable and willing, and when David led me onto the makeshift dance floor in front of the whole town and was not terrible at it, Me had looked up at him with such warm surprise that he had felt about 10 feet tall. "You practiced," she said. "Eli taught me," she laughed. "Of course he did." "I told you," David said as he turned her carefully and didn't step on her feet. "I'm working on being worthy of you." "You are going to make me cry at my own wedding," she said, which was half a warning and half not. "You're allowed," he said. "It's your day." She pressed her forehead briefly to his shoulder, just for a moment, and he held her a little closer. And around them the fiddle played and the children ran, and the Texas spring was everything it was supposed to be. They settled into their married life with a naturalness that satisfied me in ways she had not known she was missing. She kept the school for the remainder of that term, finishing the school year as she had promised, and in September she made the decision, freely and without pressure, to pass the school to a new teacher who came up from San Antonio. It was not that she did not love teaching, she did. But the ranch needed a proper manager of its household and books, which David had been managing in the rough and ready way of a man who was better with cattle than ledgers, and Me discovered that she had an aptitude for it that satisfied her deeply. She kept the school books and continued teaching Sam his more advanced arithmetic at home, and she wrote to the new teacher regularly and attended the school performances with the possessive fondness of someone who had built the thing. Her study became, over the first year of their marriage, the room that told the story of who Mae Collins Holloway was. The shelves filled with books she had always wanted to own. The desk was covered with the ordered evidence of the ranch's accounts. There was a vase of flowers from the garden she had started at the ranch, which was not as established as the garden at Mrs. Thorne's house but was coming along, the climbing roses already up the porch rail, the sunflowers in a bright row along the south fence. She had her own cup and her own tea caddy and her own lamp, and when the day was done, she had a quiet room to sit in with her books while David worked at the kitchen table with his harness or his plans for the north pasture fence, and the boys did their reading, and the ranch house was full of the warm, quiet sound of a family. There were adjustments. No two people came together without adjustments. Me had lived alone for 3 years and had her own ways of doing things. David had run his house the way he ran his ranch, practically, with order but without polish. She reorganized the kitchen in a way that made it significantly more functional, which he said nothing about until he couldn't find the good knife one morning, and she showed him where she'd put it, which was a more logical place but not where it had been for 5 years. He had said, "All right," and found it there from then on, and the subject was closed. She had more trouble with his habit of bringing work into the house, saddle soap, and tools on the kitchen table, half-mended things set on surfaces they had no business being on. She said so, with directness and without unkindness, and he made the effort, and the effort was mostly successful, and occasionally it was not, and she said so again, and the pattern was familiar to both of them as the ordinary texture of sharing a life. There was one harder conversation, in the autumn of their first year, when Mae found herself crying in her study for a reason she couldn't entirely explain to herself, something about a letter from her sister in Georgia, about missing a particular kind of quiet, about the weight of being new to everything all at once. David found her there and did not try to fix it, did not offer solutions or comfort that rushed past the feeling to get to the end of it. He sat in the chair beside her and was simply there, the way Sam had told him to be, and after a while she leaned against him and the crying worked itself out, and he said nothing except that he was there, and it was enough. She told him later, when she was herself again, that it was the most comforting thing he could have done. "I'm learning," he said. "We both are," she said. In the spring of 1880, Mae realized she was expecting their first child. She was 31 years old, which was not so young for a first child in 1878 Texas, and there were moments of private fear when she thought about the risks, thought about Clara, thought about the things that could go wrong. She did not keep this fear from David, because she had decided early in their marriage that honesty was the foundation she would not compromise on, and he received her fear the same way he received everything difficult, steadily, without minimizing it, sitting with her in it rather than trying to move her past it. He hired the best doctor available in the county, a woman named Dr. Ruth Ashby, who had studied in Philadelphia and set up practice in Fredericksburg, 20 miles from Dusty Creek, and who was one of very few female physicians in the territory. Mae had seen her twice by the time she was showing, and Dr. Ashby was capable and direct, and treated Mae as an intelligent adult who could handle information, which Mae deeply appreciated. Sam was electric with excitement about the baby. He had opinions about names, about what the nursery should look like, about whether it would be a boy or a girl, and he shared all these opinions freely and at length with anyone who would listen. Eli was quieter about it, the way Eli was always quieter, but Mae caught him one morning in January standing in the room they had set up as a nursery, looking at it with an expression she recognized something between wistfulness and hope. She stood in the doorway and didn't say anything, and after a moment Eli said, without turning around, "I used to think about having a little sibling, before." Mae came into the room and stood beside him. "Before your mother died?" "Yeah," he was quiet. "I thought it would be strange, another baby, but it doesn't feel strange." "It doesn't have to be anything in particular," Mae said. "It can just be what it is." Eli turned then and he looked at her with the full, measured attention he had, eyes like his mother's, quiet and deep. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "I mean it. I'm glad Pa found you. I'm glad you stayed." Mae put her arm around his shoulders and hugged him, and he let her, and neither of them said anything else, and it was enough. The baby was born in March 1880, on a rainy Thursday evening with Dr. Ashby in attendance, with David pacing the hall in the way of a man who could do nothing useful and was suffering from it. The baby was a boy, healthy and loud, and when the doctor came to the hall and told David he had a son, David put his face in his hands for a moment in the overwhelmed way of a man who needed to do something with the size of what he was feeling. They named him James Thomas Holloway, James for David's father, and Thomas for Mae's late husband, which had been Mae's idea, and which David had received with the understanding of a man who knew that love did not require you to erase what had come before. Sam immediately claimed James as his personal responsibility. He was 10 years old and took his position as an older brother with total seriousness, offering himself for every task except the ones that required skills he didn't yet have. Eli was gentler with James than he was with most things, holding him with the careful attention of someone who understood that small things needed protection. David held his new son in the lamplight of the bedroom while Mae slept, exhausted and safe, and looked at James's red, squirming face and felt everything. The loss of Clara, who should have had this too, and the gratitude for Mae who was here and well, and the love for this new small person who was both of them and neither, and the strange, complete circle of a life that had gone through grief and error, and a long season of getting everything wrong before arriving at something this right. He thought about the ham and almost laughed. He had sent a woman a smoked ham and called it courtship. He had loaned her a horse and thought he was being romantic. He had attended her school performance and talked about his son's behavior and thought he was making an impression. His 9-year-old had fixed it. His 9-year-old had walked into a schoolhouse with chalk-dusty trousers and asked a woman what she wanted and brought the answer home like a prize he had found in the creek bed. David looked at Sam, who was asleep in the chair in the corner with his chin on his chest, having flatly refused to go to his own bed until the baby arrived, and felt a love so large and specific it had no name that fit it. "Thank you," he said softly to the sleeping boy. "For all of it." James grew. Summers on the rocking H were full of good noise. The sound of a toddler discovering how fast he could move across a yard. The sound of Sam teaching James things of wildly varying usefulness. The sound of Eli's voice going through the inevitable changes of 15, 16, 17, and emerging on the other side as a young man's voice, deep and steady. Eli, by the time he was 17, had taken on genuine responsibility at the ranch. He had David's capability and his mother's careful attention, and he had Mae's influence in ways that showed up quietly, in the books he read, in the way he asked questions before assuming answers, in the occasional patient explanation he gave his younger brothers when they needed it. He was shaping into someone both David and Mae were deeply proud of, not in the way parents were proud of achievement, but in the way they were proud of character, which was rarer and more satisfying. The town of Dusty Creek watched the Holloways the way small towns watched families with proprietary affection, claiming their celebrations and weathering their difficulties as communal events. When the Rocking H had a hard winter in 1882 and lost a good portion of its herd to a sudden freeze, the neighboring ranchers came without being asked extra hands, extra feed. The offer of credit from the bank at terms that were genuinely good rather than merely adequate, because David Holloway had been that neighbor to all of them in previous years, and the debt ran deep. Mae organized the community response from the practical side, which was what she did. She knew who had what and who needed what and how to make the two meet without anyone being embarrassed about it. She was, by 1882, as much a part of Dusty Creek as anyone who had been born there, and perhaps more so because she had chosen it, which everyone who had ever stayed somewhere they hadn't been born understood was a different and particular kind of belonging. She was also, by the spring of 1882, expecting their second child. This time there was less fear and more of the straightforward wonder of the thing. She was 33, she was healthy. Dr. Ashby was as capable as she had always been, and Mae moved through the pregnancy with the practical attentiveness she brought to everything. She continued managing the ranch books until 2 weeks before the birth, and resumed 3 weeks after, because the ledgers did not care about her confinement, and she had found a woman in town to help with the house in the meantime. The second child was a girl, born in November 1882, and they named her Clara Mae Holloway. The Clara was David's choice, offered quietly and with some uncertainty, and Mae had said yes immediately and fully, because it was the right name and both of them knew it. The Mae was David's addition, and when he explained it because he felt it needed explaining, felt that she should know why, he said simply, because she should know from the beginning whose mother she has. Mae had been sitting up in bed with the baby in her arms, and she had looked at her husband over their daughter's head and had felt something that went beyond every adequate word she knew. She settled for, "I love you, David Holloway. "You impossible, wonderful man." And he had sat on the edge of the bed and put his arm around her and looked at their daughter and said, with the dry honesty that was his truest voice, "I love you too, even though you reorganized where the knife goes." She laughed, and the baby startled at the sound of it and looked up, that unfocused newborn gaze that seemed, improbably, to be searching for the source of something it already recognized. Me held her daughter and laughed, and David held them both, and outside the November wind came cold off the hills and the fire burned warm, and the boys were in the next room trying to be quiet with the particular loud quality of children trying to be quiet, and the rocking H was everything it had not been 5 years ago, full. Sam, at 13, greeted Clara's arrival with the informed enthusiasm of someone who had already been through the newborn stage with James and considered himself an expert. He held her with ease, bounced her when she fussed, sang to her without embarrassment, and generally regarded her with the devoted attention he brought to everything he loved. James, who was 2, was fascinated and uncertain in equal measure, and approached Clara with the cautious intensity of a small person encountering something new that required careful evaluation. Christmas 1882 was the best Christmas the Rocking H had ever had, which everyone in the house privately thought, and David said out loud on Christmas morning, while the children were occupied with the small gifts, wooden toys for James. A good thick wool blanket Sam had somehow kept secret for weeks, a fine new atlas for Eli who was still making his maps, and me was sitting with Clara in the rocking chair by the fire with a cup of tea. "This is the best Christmas," David said from the doorway, looking at all of it. Me looked up at him. "It is," she agreed. "I didn't know it could be like this," he said. "I thought I knew what a full house felt like, but I didn't, not really." Me understood what he meant because she understood him, which was the deepest comfort of a long marriage, that understanding built not from explanation but from time and attention, and the particular intimacy of knowing someone's silences as well as their words. "It keeps getting better," she said. "That's the thing about it. Every year there's more of it." David came and sat beside her, looking at their children, at Eli showing Sam something in the atlas, and Sam leaning over his brother's shoulder with his characteristic intensity, at James banging his wooden horse against the floor in the cheerful way of a 2-year-old who had no other agenda. He put his arm around Me's shoulders and she leaned into him, and Clara slept in her arms with the profound peace of a new person who knows nothing yet of the world and needs to know nothing because she is held. The years moved forward in the way of good years, which seemed both long and quick at the same time, long in the living of them, quick in the looking back. Eli grew into his full size and came fully into partnership with his father at the ranch, taking on the north pasture as his own responsibility and showing a particular aptitude for the management of it. At 19, he began calling me Me rather than Miss Collins, which had been his formality for years, and she received it with the quiet warmth of someone who had waited for it without hurrying. At 20, Eli fell quietly in love with the daughter of the neighboring rancher, a steady young woman named Louisa Vargas, whose family had been in the hill country since before Texas was a state, and whom me liked immediately and without reservation. Sam grew the opposite way, outward rather than upward, into a talker and a thinker and a person who could not walk through Dusty Creek without stopping to talk to 6 people. He was exactly the kind of person Chester the barber had once been and was passing the baton to. A keeper of the community's story, a connector of people, a man who noticed things and acted on what he noticed. He was also, at 14 and 15 and 16, a considerable source of trouble of the harmless variety. Too many schemes, too many projects, too much enthusiasm for things that seemed like good ideas at the time. But he was never malicious, and he had the good nature to take the consequences of his adventures without complaint, which made it very hard to stay properly annoyed with him. He told me, one evening when he was 15, and she was helping him with a geography lesson that had gotten away from him, that he thought he wanted to go to school properly, to a real school, not just the schoolhouse in Dusty Creek, and that he wanted to study law because he thought there were things in Texas that needed to be made right, and law was how you made them right. He said it with the careful earnestness of a boy who had thought about it for a long time before saying it out loud. Mae had looked at him for a moment. Then she had asked him what things needed to be made right. And Sam had talked, with the considered intelligence of a boy who listened and remembered and cared, about the land rights disputes he had seen the neighboring Mexican families lose in court because they couldn't afford proper representation, about the way the Comanche and the Apache were being handled. The term he used was handled, and about how it seemed to him that a law that was only available to people with money was not much of a law. Mae had listened to every word. Then she had said, "All right. Then you should go. Let's talk to your father." David had taken the news of Sam's ambitions with the steady attention he brought to everything important. He had questions, reasonable ones about cost and timeline, and what Sam intended to do with it when he was done. Sam had answers mostly, and where he didn't he said so. David had agreed in the end, the way he had always agreed to things his boys needed when he could see that they needed them truly, not with enthusiasm, because enthusiasm was not his mode, but with a complete and solid yes. Sam left for Austin at 17 to read law in the office of an attorney there, who had been recommended by Reverend Pickard. He came back to Dusty Creek for Christmases, and for the summer he was 18, when he worked the ranch with his father and Eli, and spent the evenings talking with me on the porch about the cases he was watching and the things he was learning. He grew into his own kind of man, still the talker, still the noticer, but with a new layer of considered seriousness under the easy warmth. James grew up ranch-born in the way his older brothers had not quite been, having been there since before he could remember, and he had his father's quietness and his mother's eyes, and a particular ability with horses that David had never seen in a child so young. He could read a horse the way some people read faces, not as a trained skill but as a simple understanding, the way some people were made with a language inside them that other people had to learn from outside. Mae watched James grow with the particular tenderness of a mother who had been there from the first minute of his life, and with the private wonder of someone who had not expected to have children of her own, and had received the gift of it with the full depth of that surprise. She held him fiercely and loosely at the same time, the way the best mothers did, present and clear, and prepared to let go when the letting go was the loving thing. By 1886, the Rocking H was a prosperous and respected ranch, David Holloway's name associated in the hill country with both the quality of his cattle and the quality of his word. He was 42 years old, in his full strength, silver-haired now in earnest rather than just at the temples, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had worked hard and built something real, and had the particular contentment of someone who was in the right place with the right people. Mae was 37, and she was more herself than she had ever been, which was the particular prize of a good marriage, that it did not require you to be less in order to fit. She still read voraciously, ordered her books from San Antonio with the faithful regularity of a continuing relationship, and the study with its east-facing windows was still entirely hers. She had written several letters to the San Antonio Express on matters of public interest that had been published, which gave her a quiet satisfaction she did not discuss much, but which David noticed, and was proud of in the specific way. He was proud of things he had not done, a large and clean-handed pride with no ownership in it. Eli married Luisa Vargas in the summer of 1886, in a ceremony at the Vargas family's ranch that was beautiful in the way of two communities celebrating together, with music and food from both traditions and the feeling of something being joined that was already good. David and me stood at the edge of it and watched Eli take Luisa's hand, and me felt David's hand find hers as they stood there, as natural as breathing, and she squeezed it once and he squeezed back. "He's going to be all right," me said softly. "He's going to be better than all right," David said. "He's Eli." They had a grandson by the following spring, born to Eli and Louisa in March 1887, a dark-eyed boy they named Marco David Holloway. And Sam came back from Austin for the occasion and held Marco with the ease of someone who had been holding babies since James. And James sat in the corner and regarded his nephew with the careful analytical interest that was purely James. The ranch house at the Rocking H was full in all the old ways and some new ones. Eli and Louisa, in the north addition that David had built when the engagement was announced. James at 12 taking up more space than a boy should need, and Marco in his basket by the fire, and Me's roses climbing the new porch railing, and the sunflowers coming back every summer along the south fence with the faithful optimism of things that know where they belong. Chester the barber retired in 1888 and told anyone who would listen that the great achievement of his professional career was recognizing, from across the street, that David Holloway going to Mae Collins's garden without a package under his arm was the beginning of something worth watching. This account was substantially revised from what Chester had actually said at the time, which had been more cautious, but by 1888 nobody was going to argue with Chester the barber about his own memory, and the broad strokes of it were true enough. Mrs. Eliza Thorne, who was still sharp and still missed nothing, gave me a gift on the occasion of Me's 40th birthday, a framed embroidery of climbing roses, which she had made herself, and which she presented with the dry brevity of someone who felt everything but expressed it sparingly. "You made this place better," Mrs. Thorne said. "I knew you would when you asked about the room to let, something in the way you looked at the hills." Mae had hung it in her study, where she could see it from her chair. Sam passed his bar examination in the autumn of 1888 at 20 years of age, one of the younger men to do so in the Austin office's recent memory, and he came back to Dusty Creek to practice, which surprised some people who had expected him to stay in Austin, where the bigger cases were. Sam explained, patiently and with good cheer, that the people who needed a lawyer who would fight for them were right here, not in Austin, and that he had grown up watching the Vargas family and others like them lose things they should not have lost, and he intended to be the kind of lawyer who prevented that. He was exactly that kind of lawyer. It is worth saying plainly. David sat on the porch on a September evening in 1889 when James had gone in to bed and Eli and Louisa and Marco were quiet in the north addition, and Mae came out with 2 cups of tea and sat beside him in the way she had been sitting beside him for more than 10 years now, and they looked at the stars coming out over the dark Texas hills, which were the same stars and the same hills they had always been. "You know what I think about," David said. "Tell me," Mae said. "Sam." He turned his cup in his hands, 9 years old and chalk on his trousers, asking you what you actually wanted, like it was the most obvious thing in the world to ask. Mae smiled, and the smile went all the way to her eyes. "He knew you needed help. He saved me from myself," David said. "I'd have kept bringing things and lending horses until you gave up on the whole idea of me." "I don't know about that," Mae said. "I might have figured it out eventually. It might have taken another year." "Maybe," she allowed. "And we'd have missed a year," he said. "A year of the boys and James and Clara and all of it." Mae was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. Then she said, "We would have found each other, David, somehow, I believe that." He turned to look at her. In the 10 years and more of their marriage, he had never quite gotten over the particular quality of her. The way she looked at him with those clear gray eyes that had always seen him more completely than anyone else had, including himself. He was 45 years old, and his body had the honest wear of the work he had chosen, and he was more certain of who he was than he had ever been in his youth, and he was more in love with Mae Collins Holloway than he had been in the garden in September of 1878, which had been, at the time, more love than he had thought he was capable of feeling. "I love you," he said, "in case I haven't said it today." "You said it this morning," she said. "But say it again." "I love you, Mae." She leaned against his shoulder and his arm came around her, and they sat in the evening with the stars and the cedar and the warm sound of the house behind them, the occasional creak of the floorboards as James turned over in his bed, the faint sound of Marco saying something in his sleep in the North Addition, the old, settling language of a house full of sleeping people. "I love you back," Mae said. "That never stops being true." They had 21 good years ahead of them after that September evening, which they did not know, because people don't know their futures and only get to live them. They would see Eli and Louisa have 2 more children after Marco. They would see Sam become exactly the lawyer he had intended to be, fighting cases that mattered in the hill country courts and winning a fair number of them. They would see James at 16 find that his gift with horses made him worth consulting by every rancher in 3 counties. They would see Clara grow into a person of startling clarity and humor, with Mae's eyes and David's steadiness, and her own particular fire that was entirely herself. They would have hard years too, because the honest telling of a life has to include them. A drought that took a difficult toll in 1892, a fever that came through the county in 1895, and frightened them badly though the family came through it, the ordinary losses of age, the gradual quieting of a house as children grew and moved into their own lives. David's hair went fully silver and remained considerable. Mae's dark hair acquired threads of silver she wore without apology, and they suited her in the way that the marks of a well-lived life suit some people who have been genuinely themselves throughout the living of it. On the evening of their 20th anniversary, in the spring of 1899, they sat in the garden at the ranch house. The same bench, older now, repaired twice over the years with climbing roses that had been trained along the new porch rail for 15 years and were now as established as the house itself. The sunflowers were coming up along the south fence. The mockingbird was still at it, or one of its descendants was, which amounted to the same thing. Sam, who was 30 years old and still had the same quality of noticing things and acting on them, had organized a family supper for the occasion, with Eli and Louisa and their 3 children, and Clara, who was 17 and had opinions about everything including the menu, and James, who was 19 and had come in from the north pasture still smelling of horses, and had changed his shirt without being asked, which was progress. After supper, when the children were doing whatever young people did and the evening was quiet, David and Mae had come to the garden as they so often did with their tea with the stars. 20 years, David said. 20 years, Mae agreed. "Best decision I ever made," he said, "coming to your garden with my hat in my hand and nothing else." "Best decision Sam ever pushed you toward," Mae said with warmth. "He pushed. I walked," David said. "I walked there all by myself." "You did," she said. "That was the bravest thing you'd done in years." He looked at her in the evening light. This woman who had chosen Dusty Creek because a wagon wheel broke, who had built a life here by the simple force of being completely herself, who had given him the gift of understanding what love actually required rather than what it was convenient to give. He thought about the ham, as he occasionally still did, with the rueful affection of a man who has made peace with his own foolishness. He thought about Sam in the schoolhouse, 9 years old and serious, asking Mae Collins what she actually wanted. He thought about the answer, someone who just sits with me, someone who comes and wants to be where I am. He had been practicing that for 20 years and he was still learning it, still finding new depths in it, still occasionally reverting to fixing things when the better answer was to be present. And Mae still told him so, with the honest directness that had been hers from the beginning, and he was still grateful for it every time. "I never got it perfectly right," he said, "all of it 20 years in." "Neither did I," she said. "That's not the measure." "What's the measure?" She turned and looked at him with those clear gray eyes that had first looked up at him from a garden on a September Sunday in 1878, and she said, "Whether you kept showing up, whether it was real, whether you stayed." "Yes," he said, "to all of it." "Then you got it right," she said. "We both did." The mockingbird was singing in the cedar tree. The roses were old and thick and blooming. The stars were coming out over the Texas hills, the same stars, the same hills, the wide and beautiful permanence of a sky over two people who had found their way to each other by the unlikely grace of a 9-year-old with chalk on his trousers and the wisdom to ask the right question. David took Mae's hand in the garden. She laced her fingers through his, and the evening settled around them, warm and good and held.